It was supposed to be an ordinary day, coffee with a friend, a casual chat. But the moment his hand brushed mine, a spark ignited, and I knew my life was about to spiral out of control. At 52, I've always prided myself on my independence. Life after my divorce wasn't easy, but I found ways to fill the void. Coffee dates with friends, immersing myself in work, and taking small joys where I could. Yet, in those quiet moments before falling asleep, the loneliness had a way of creeping in, wrapping itself around me like an unwanted blanket. I used to be someone who believed in forever. My ex-husband and I were the perfect couple, or so everyone thought. Until the day I found out about his betrayal, a discovery that shattered my trust in love. Since then, I've buried my emotions under layers of poise and strength, pretending to be unshaken. Olivia, my best friend and confidant, has always been there through it all. Like me, she's divorced, navigating a life that sometimes feels more uncertain than we'd like to admit. On that particular morning, I met her at our favorite cafe. It was our routine, a moment of escape from the silence that often haunts our homes. I dressed carefully, choosing a light blouse and a skirt that I hadn't worn in years. I glanced in the mirror before leaving, whispering to myself, "You're still beautiful." It was a mantra I needed to hear, a way to remind myself that I still had something to offer the world, even if I didn't quite believe it. As Olivia and I talked about the past and the disappointments of the present, my gaze wandered outside the cafe window. That's when I saw my nephew Thomas. He's always been a bright light in my life, charming, full of energy, and respectful. But what truly caught my attention wasn't Thomas. It was the man standing next to him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly captivating, he seemed to command the space around him without even trying. I later learned his name, Ryan. He was 27, only a few years older than Thomas, but there was something about the way he carried himself that set him apart. When his eyes briefly met mine, it was as if the world stopped for a moment. I quickly shook off the feeling, embarrassed by my own thoughts. He's just a friend of Thomas, I reminded myself. But deep down, I knew this encounter was going to leave a mark I wouldn't be able to erase. Later that day, as I settled back into the quiet of my home, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. It wasn't just his striking appearance or the way he carried himself. It was the feeling he left behind, a quiet pull I couldn't seem to shake. I busied myself with household tasks, trying to brush it off as a fleeting moment of distraction. But it wasn't that simple. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was Thomas. "Aunt Caddy, are you home? I'm nearby with Ryan. We can swing by and help with anything you need." My heart raced at the mention of his name, but I quickly masked my excitement. "Sure," I replied casually. "I could use a hand setting up the new TV I just got." When they arrived, Thomas was his usual cheerful self, joking about the size of the box I'd ordered. Ryan, however, was quieter, more observant. The moment he stepped inside, his presence seemed to shift the atmosphere. As they began unboxing and setting up the system, I tried to stay busy, offering drinks and chatting with Thomas. But every time I glanced at Ryan, his gaze was already on me. Intense, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. At one point, as Ryan handed me a cable, his hand brushed against mine. It was a small, accidental touch, but it sent a jolt through me. "Sorry," he said, his voice calm yet carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. I forced a smile, pretending not to notice the way my heart was racing. As the afternoon went on, I became acutely aware of his every move. The way his muscles flexed as he worked, the quiet confidence in his demeanor. It was magnetic. And then there were the moments when our eyes met, brief but charged with an unspoken tension. I felt like a teenager again, caught in a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite understand. After they finished setting up the system, I offered to make coffee. "Take a break," I said, retreating to the kitchen. As I brewed the coffee, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I found Ryan standing in the doorway, his arms loosely crossed and his eyes fixed on me. "I just wanted to say thank you for having us over," he said, his voice steady but carrying a warmth that made my breath catch. His gaze lingered, moving from my eyes to the hem of my skirt before quickly returning. "No need to thank me," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "If anything, I should thank you for helping with the setup." Ryan chuckled softly, leaning against the counter. "You seem like the kind of person who's used to handling things on her own," he said. "But it's nice to have help sometimes, isn't it?" His words struck a chord I wasn't prepared for. I nodded, feeling an inexplicable vulnerability in his presence. "It is," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Before I could say anything more, Thomas called from the living room, breaking the spell. Ryan hesitated for a moment, his eyes holding mine, before turning and walking away. But the weight of that moment lingered, filling the air with a tension I couldn't ignore. As they left that evening, Thomas was his usual playful self, joking about the movie night I'd promised to host. Ryan, on the other hand, offered a polite smile and a quiet, "Let me know if you need anything else." But when our eyes met one last time, the intensity in his gaze told a different story, one that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The silence in the house after they left felt heavier than usual. The new TV stood proudly in the living room, but my thoughts were consumed by Ryan, his calm demeanor, his lingering glances, and the undeniable connection that seemed to spark every time he was near. The days that followed were a blur of routine, yet my thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. I told myself it was just a harmless infatuation, a fleeting distraction from the monotony of life. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. His presence had awakened something in me, an ache I hadn't felt in years, a longing I didn't know still existed. I busied myself with work and errands, hoping the feelings would fade. But one evening, as I settled down to watch something on my newly installed TV, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ryan. "Hi, Caddy. Just checking in to see if everything's working with the system. Let me know if you need anything." I stared at the message for longer than I should have, my heart pounding in my chest. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally typed back. "Everything's great. Thanks again for your help." His response came almost instantly. "Glad to hear. If you're free sometime, I'd love to stop by and show you some features you might not have explored yet." My pulse quickened as I read his words. It was a simple offer, polite and helpful on the surface, but the tone felt different, more personal. After a moment's hesitation, I replied, "That sounds great. Let me know when you're free." When the day finally came, I found myself standing in front of the mirror for far too long, adjusting my hair, choosing the right outfit. I settled on a simple but elegant dress that felt both casual and flattering. When the doorbell rang, my heart was already racing. Ryan greeted me with his usual calm confidence, holding a small bouquet of flowers in his hand. "Thought I'd bring something to brighten your space," he said with a faint smile. I felt a warmth spread through me as I took the flowers, his thoughtful gesture catching me off guard. As we sat down to explore the TV's features, the atmosphere between us shifted. The casual conversation was laced with an undercurrent of tension, subtle glances, fleeting touches as we passed the remote back and forth. Each moment felt charged, as though we were teetering on the edge of something neither of us wanted to name. At one point, as I leaned forward to adjust the volume, Ryan's hand brushed against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a spark through me. I looked up to find him watching me, his gaze intense and unwavering. "You've got a great eye for detail," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Everything about this place reflects you. Elegant, strong, and captivating." His words hung in the air, the compliment loaded with unspoken meaning. I felt my cheeks flush as I tried to brush it off with a laugh. "I've just had a lot of time to make it my own," I said, avoiding his gaze. Ryan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Caddy," he began, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper. "I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way, but there's something about you. The way you carry yourself, the strength in your eyes. It's rare, and it's impossible to ignore." I was caught off guard by the raw honesty in his words. My instinct was to deflect, to make light of it, but the intensity in his gaze held me in place. "Ryan," I started, unsure of what to say. Before I could finish, he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. "I don't want to overstep," he said softly, "but I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day we met." His confession sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. Excitement, fear, guilt, and an undeniable pull toward him. My mind raced with reasons why this was a bad idea, why we should stop this before it went any further. But as I looked into his eyes, filled with sincerity and longing, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "Ryan," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is complicated. Life is complicated," he replied, his hand tightening slightly around mine. "But sometimes, the things that scare us the most are the things worth pursuing." The room seemed to shrink around us, the tension thick and electric. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he leaned closer, his gaze flicking from my eyes to my lips. I didn't move, frozen in the moment, until his lips brushed mine. A soft, tentative kiss that sent a shiver down my spine. When we pulled back, the air between us felt heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," Ryan said quietly, though his eyes told a different story. "I just couldn't stop myself." I shook my head, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. "Don't apologize," I said, surprising myself with the words. I don't know where this is going, but I can't deny how I feel." The vulnerability in my voice seemed to give him courage. He smiled faintly, his hand still resting on mine. "Then let's not think about where it's going," he said. "Let's just take it one step at a time." And in that moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, some risks were worth taking. For days after that moment with Ryan, my thoughts were a chaotic mess. Every glance, every word we had exchanged replayed in my mind like a movie I couldn't turn off. I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but I could feel the shift in myself, a spark that had been ignited, refusing to be extinguished. Ryan and I began texting more frequently, our conversations growing longer and more personal with each exchange. What started as polite check-ins about the TV soon turned into late-night messages about life, dreams, and the loneliness we both tried to mask. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years, and I found myself looking forward to his messages more than I cared to admit. Then one evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed. It was Ryan. "Can I stop by? I have something I want to share with you." I hesitated, my heart racing as I stared at the message. I knew what inviting him over again could lead to, but my resolve crumbled under the weight of my curiosity, and, if I was honest, my desire to see him again. "Of course," I replied, adding a small smile emoji at the end. When he arrived, the sight of him standing in my doorway felt different this time. He wasn't just Ryan, the friend of my nephew. He was Ryan, the man who had quietly unraveled parts of me I thought were long gone. He held a bottle of wine in one hand and a small notebook in the other. "What's this?" I asked, gesturing to the notebook as I led him inside. "It's something personal," he said, his voice soft. "But I wanted to share it with you." We sat down in the living room, the wine poured and the notebook resting between us. Ryan opened it, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and snippets of poetry. He explained that he had always loved writing but had never shared his work with anyone before. "I don't know why," he admitted, his eyes searching mine. "But I feel like I can trust you with this." I was touched by his vulnerability, the way he laid himself bare before me without hesitation. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a deeper connection to him. His words were raw, emotional, and brimming with a depth I hadn't expected. "You're incredibly talented," I said, looking up at him. "Thank you for sharing this with me." His gaze softened, and for a moment, the air between us felt heavy with unspoken words. "There's something else I need to share," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Something I've been holding back." My heart pounded as I waited for him to continue. "I've tried to stay away," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I know this is complicated, and I know what people would say if they found out. But Caddy, I can't ignore what I feel for you." His words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on me. I wanted to respond, to tell him I felt the same, but my voice caught in my throat. Before I could say anything, he leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. This time, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. I let myself get lost in the moment, in the way his touch made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But just as the kiss deepened, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. I pulled back abruptly, my heart leaping into my throat as I turned to see Thomas standing in the doorway, his expression frozen in shock. "Thomas," I stammered, scrambling to my feet. This isn't—" He raised a hand, cutting me off. "I don't need an explanation," he said, his voice cold. His eyes darted between Ryan and me, the hurt and disbelief written all over his face. I can see exactly what's going on. Ryan stood as well, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a look of unease. "Thomas, don't," Thomas snapped, his voice sharp. "I trusted you, Ryan. I brought you here, introduced you to my family, and this is how you repay me?" The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Thomas, please," I tried again, desperation creeping into my voice. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," he said, his voice breaking. "How could you do this, Aunt Caddy? How could you betray me like this?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm raging around us. "Thomas, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen, but it did. And I care about your aunt more than you realize." Thomas let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I don't want to hear it," he said. "I don't want to hear anything from either of you." Before I could stop him, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving an unbearable silence in its wake. I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. Ryan sat down beside me, his hand resting gently on my arm. "Caddy," he said softly, "we'll figure this out. I promise." But as I looked at him, the weight of what we had done began to settle in. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the trust we had broken, the lines we had crossed, and the fallout that was sure to come. The night stretched on, the silence between us filled with unspoken fears and lingering tension. And as the first light of morning crept through the windows, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of that night was a whirlwind of emotions. Thomas's reaction haunted me, replaying in my mind over and over again. The look of betrayal in his eyes was something I couldn't erase, no matter how much I tried to justify my actions. Guilt and regret gnawed at me, but there was another feeling I couldn't ignore, an undeniable connection to Ryan that refused to let me go. I spent the next few days in a haze, avoiding calls and messages from Thomas. He had always been like a son to me, and the idea that I had hurt him so deeply felt unbearable. But every time I thought about reaching out, I was paralyzed by the fear of what I would say. What could I say to make him understand something I barely understood myself? Ryan, on the other hand, was steady and supportive. He called and texted regularly, his words reassuring and full of hope. "We'll get through this," he kept saying. But I couldn't help but wonder if we had already caused irreparable damage. Finally, one afternoon, Thomas called. His tone was clipped, his words measured. "We need to talk," he said. I agreed, knowing I couldn't avoid this confrontation forever. We met at a quiet cafe, the same one where I had first seen Ryan. Thomas arrived with a hard expression, his usual warmth replaced by a coldness that broke my heart. "I don't even know where to start," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "How long has this been going on?" "It wasn't planned," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "It just happened." "That's not an answer," he snapped, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You're my family, Caddy. You're supposed to be someone I can trust. And Ryan, he was my friend. How could you let this happen?" I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said softly. "I never wanted any of this to happen. But Thomas, I can't ignore how I feel about him." Thomas let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Feelings? That's your excuse? Do you know what this has done to me? I can't even look at Ryan without feeling sick." "I know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I know I've hurt you, and I'm so sorry." His expression softened for a moment, but the pain in his eyes remained. "I don't think you understand, Caddy. This isn't just about me. This is about trust, about loyalty. You've crossed a line that you can't uncross." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I knew he was right. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. When Thomas left, I felt a weight settle over me, a deep, crushing sadness that I couldn't shake. Ryan called that evening, sensing my distress. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Not well," I admitted. "He's hurt, Ryan. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me." Ryan was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Do you regret it?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I thought about everything that had happened, the guilt, the pain, but also the moments of joy and connection I had shared with him. "I don't know," I said finally. "I regret hurting Thomas, but I can't bring myself to regret you." His silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "I don't want to cause you more pain," he said softly. "Maybe we should take a step back, give things time to settle." As much as it hurt, I knew he was right. "Maybe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to lose you, Ryan." "You won't," he promised. Not completely. Over the next few weeks, I tried to piece my life back together. Thomas kept his distance, his texts brief and formal. Ryan and I stopped seeing each other, though we continued to exchange occasional messages. The connection between us hadn't faded, but the weight of our choices loomed over everything. One evening, as I sat alone in my living room, I received a message from Thomas. "I think we need to talk again." We met at my house this time, the atmosphere heavy with tension. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his tone softer than before. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, but I also know I can't lose you. You're family, Caddy. That means something." Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "It means everything," I said. "And I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "It's going to take time," he warned. "But I'm willing to try." As Thomas left that night, I felt a small glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for healing. For all of us. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild the pieces of my life, one fragile step at a time. My relationship with Thomas remained strained, but his willingness to try gave me a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Our conversations were careful, filled with long pauses and cautious words. But they were conversations nonetheless, a foundation upon which we could slowly rebuild trust. Ryan and I stayed in touch, though our interactions were less frequent. He respected the space I needed, but the connection between us hadn't disappeared. Every message, every brief call reminded me of what we shared. Yet, I also knew that moving forward required me to confront my feelings honestly, not just with Ryan, but with myself. One afternoon, while sorting through old photos, I came across a picture of myself and Thomas from years ago. We were laughing, carefree, and full of joy, a stark contrast to the weight we carried now. The sight of that photo brought tears to my eyes. It reminded me of what I stood to lose if I didn't work to mend the rift between us. That evening, I invited Thomas over for dinner. I spent hours preparing his favorite meal, hoping it would be a small gesture of how much I wanted to make things right. When he arrived, the tension in the air was palpable, but as we sat down to eat, it began to ease. We talked about light-hearted things at first: work, mutual friends, even memories of family holidays. It wasn't until the plates were cleared that the conversation took a more serious turn. "I don't want to lose you, Thomas," I said, my voice trembling. "You mean too much to me." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to lose you either, Aunt Caddy. But it's going to take time. Trust doesn't come back overnight." "I know," I said, nodding. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." His expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of the warmth that had always defined our relationship. "We'll figure it out," he said, "one step at a time." As he left that night, I felt a small but significant shift. A sign that while things would never be the same, they could still be salvaged. With Ryan, things were more complicated. Though we hadn't seen each other in weeks, he was still on my mind, his presence lingering in the quiet moments of my day. One evening, I decided to call him. "I've been thinking about us," I said when he answered. "And?" His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "I think we need to let go," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Not because I don't care about you, but because there are too many people we've hurt. And I need to focus on fixing that." There was a long pause before he spoke. "I understand," he said finally. "I don't regret a moment with you, Caddy. But if letting go is what you need, then I'll respect that." The conversation ended with a mixture of relief and heartache. Saying goodbye to Ryan felt like closing the door on something beautiful, yet flawed. Something that had brought both joy and pain. In the months that followed, I focused on healing, my relationship with Thomas, my sense of self, and the pieces of my life that had been fractured. I learned to find joy in the small things again. A morning cup of coffee, a walk in the park, the laughter of a friend. And though the guilt of what had happened lingered, I found a way to live with it, to use it as a reminder of the lessons I had learned. Life is messy, full of mistakes and missteps, but it's also full of second chances, if we're willing to work for them. I'll never forget Ryan, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But I'll also never forget the cost of that connection, the people I hurt, and the trust I broke along the way. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that love, no matter how tempting, must always be rooted in respect and integrity. Without that, it's not love, it's chaos. And while chaos may feel thrilling in the moment, It's the quiet stability of real, honest relationships that truly stands the test of time. What would you do if faced with a choice like mine? Would you follow your heart or protect the bonds you've built over a lifetime? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that challenge your emotions and make you think. Stay tuned, because the next chapter might just be the most shocking yet.